At 13 years old, there wasn't much that could keep me inside. Every day after school, my friends and I would head straight to the forest at the edge of town. It was our world, a place where the adults never ventured, and we could let our imaginations run wild. Each time we explored, we found new hiding spots, secret trails, and forgotten corners that seemed to belong only to us. But after a while, the familiar paths lost their excitement. I wanted to find something more, something none of us had seen before. That's how I ended up standing at the forest's edge one afternoon, alone. The air felt heavier without my friends there, the silence a little sharper. But the urge to find something new pulled me forward, deeper into the woods. The forest seemed different when I was on my own. Every sound felt louder, every rustle of leaves sharper, but that only made it more thrilling. With each step, I imagined what might be waiting just beyond the next tree, a hidden cabin, an ancient treehouse, or something else entirely. I grinned at the thought. Today would be the day I found something truly special. The forest grew thicker as I ventured farther from the usual paths. Branches snagged at my clothes, and patches of moss squelched under my shoes. I didn't mind. I was too caught up in the excitement of exploring unfamiliar ground. After what felt like hours of walking, I spotted something unusual through the trees. At first, it looked like a pile of stones, but as I got closer, I realized it was the crumbling remains of a house. Its walls, once sturdy, had cracked and sagged with age. Vines twisted through the broken windows, reclaiming the ruins for the forest. I stood in front of the old house, marveling at my discovery. It felt like I had stumbled upon a secret that had been hidden for years. My friends would be jealous when I told them about this place. But I wasn't thinking about them now. This was my adventure, and I wanted to explore every inch of it. I stepped carefully over the broken threshold, my shoes crunching against shattered glass and splintered wood. Inside, the remains of old furniture lay scattered, chairs missing legs, a table split in half. I ran my hands over the rough surfaces, feeling the weight of time in every crack and splinter. As I wandered through the ruins, my eyes caught something odd beneath a pile of debris. I knelt and brushed away the leaves and dirt, revealing a wooden hatch, half buried and covered in moss. Excitement surged through me. A hidden basement? This was exactly the kind of discovery I'd been hoping for. I grabbed the rusty handle and gave it a tug. The hatch groaned in protest, but finally swung open, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. I hesitated for a moment, the thrill of adventure warring with a growing unease. The basement smelled of damp earth and old wood, and the air that drifted up from below was cool against my skin. Something about the darkness made my skin prickle, but curiosity pushed me forward. I stepped onto the ladder carefully, testing the rungs as I began to climb down. They creaked under my weight, but they seemed sturdy enough, or so I thought. About halfway down, one of the wooden rungs gave way with a sharp crack. I barely had time to react before I tumbled downward, the ladder jerking under me. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a moment I lay there, stunned and gasping for breath. My arms and legs ached, and sharp pain radiated from my side where I had landed awkwardly. I groaned, trying to collect myself, but just as I sat up, a sound froze me in place. It was a low, shuffling noise, barely more than a whisper against the walls of the basement. But it was there, and it was close. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs. I looked around frantically, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering in from the open hatch above. The basement was mostly empty, except for a few broken crates and an old wooden box in the corner. Without thinking, I crawled toward the box, wincing at the sharp pain in my side. I pressed myself against it, trying to make myself as small as possible. My breathing came in short, shallow bursts, every inhale feeling too loud, too obvious. Then from the darkness, a figure emerged. The figure moved slowly, each step deliberate and unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world. From where I hid, I could only make out its outline, a dark, shifting shape that seemed neither human nor entirely unfamiliar. Its movements made my skin crawl. It glided across the room, its steps dragging slightly, as if it had only just woken from a long slumber. I held my breath, pressing myself harder against the wooden box, hoping to blend into the darkness. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I peeked out from behind the box, watching as the figure swayed gently, almost as if it was searching for something, or someone. It didn't make any noise beyond the soft shuffling of its steps, and that silence was worse than anything it could have said or done. The figure seemed to linger, as if sensing my presence but unsure of where to find me. Every muscle in my body ached from tension, but I didn't dare move. Time dragged on endlessly. The figure wandered slowly around the basement, pausing now and then as if it was listening for something I couldn't hear. I stayed perfectly still, willing myself not to breathe too loudly, not to give myself away. Every moment felt like an eternity. The figure passed close to the box once, so near I could feel the air shift with its movement. My pulse quickened, fear clawing at me from the inside, but somehow I managed to stay silent. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to retreat. It moved back into the shadows with the same deliberate slowness, as if it knew it had all the time in the world to return. The basement grew still and silent once more, but I knew better than to move right away. I waited, straining to hear any sign of the figure's return. Minutes ticked by, and the silence pressed down on me like a weight. When I was sure the figure was gone, I finally allowed myself to move. My body ached from the effort of staying still for so long, but I ignored the pain. I needed to get out. Now, I crawled toward the ladder as quietly as I could, avoiding the broken rung that had sent me tumbling earlier. My hands shook as I gripped the wood, forcing myself to climb slowly and steadily, each movement precise. The ladder groaned under my weight, but it held. With each step up, I felt a little closer to safety. The cool night air drifted down from the open hatch above, urging me forward. When I finally reached the top, I scrambled out of the basement and into the ruins of the old house. Without looking back, I slammed the hatch shut and ran. The pain in my side flared with every step, but fear kept me moving. I didn't stop until I was deep in the forest, far away from the ruins and the dark presence lurking below. Only then did I allow myself to catch my breath, my chest heaving as I leaned against a tree for support. I made it home safely that night, but the events in the basement stayed with me. Even now, years later, I can still remember every detail: the cracked walls, the wooden hatch, and the figure that moved so slowly, so deliberately. I never told anyone about what happened that day. Not my parents, not my friends. It felt like a secret too heavy to share, something that belonged to that strange, forgotten place in the woods. The fuel light blinked angrily on the dashboard, and I cursed under my breath. It was one of those days, everything running on fumes, and me along with it. I didn't have time to second guess. The nearest station wasn't far, but the needle was so low I could practically hear the engine's hunger. I pressed down on the gas, hoping I'd make it before the car sputtered out beneath me. The streets felt odd, unusually empty for the time of night. Even with the hum of my tires on the asphalt, it felt too quiet, like the air was thick, waiting for something to happen. I rubbed my eyes and stayed focused. Just a few more minutes. That's when I saw her. A woman stood on the shoulder, her arms flailing frantically in the glare of my headlights. Her clothes clung to her like she'd been running, and the look on her face told me she was desperate, scared even. Something about the way she waved caught me off guard. Not like someone with a car problem, but someone running from something worse. My better judgment told me to keep driving. I only had enough gas to make it to the station, and every second wasted could leave me stranded. But something else told me to stop. I eased off the gas, pulled over, and rolled down the window. The woman's face was pale, eyes darting as if she expected someone to leap out of the dark at any second. "Please," she gasped. "I need to get away. He's coming." She climbed into the car before I could even ask who he was. She slammed the door shut, her chest heaving as if the air had been knocked out of her. I barely had time to process what was happening before she spoke again, her voice low and frantic. "My ex-boyfriend, I escaped. He's going to kill me if he finds me." Her words hit hard, as if they carried the weight of too many close calls. I could see the fear carved into her face. Fear that told me this wasn't some overblown domestic fight. She was running from something real, and it was catching up fast. My hands were already on the wheel, and instinct took over. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas, the car jolting forward into the night. She clutched her seatbelt with white knuckles, as if every bump in the road brought her closer to the man she feared. A part of me knew this could get bad. Too many variables, too many unknowns. But I couldn't just leave her there. Not after seeing the way she looked back at the road, as though someone might crawl out of the shadows at any second. We tore through empty streets, Violet's breath shallow and ragged beside me. I tried to keep my focus on the road, but the tension was infectious, creeping into my thoughts and twisting my gut into knots. Every corner we turned, I half expected to see headlights appear, to hear tires screeching behind us. And then I saw them. At first they were just a pair of distant lights on the road, but they were closing in, too fast to be anything but trouble. "That's him," Violet whispered. Her voice cracked like a breaking branch, brittle and full of panic. I gripped the wheel tighter, my pulse thudding in my ears. The car behind us gained speed, weaving through the streets with an unsettling confidence, as if the driver knew these roads like the back of his hand. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. I could feel the intent in the way those headlights bore down on us. The chase was on, and every turn felt like a gamble. I veered off the main road, taking side streets and cutting through alleys. The walls of old buildings blurred past us as I pushed the car faster, trying to gain even a sliver of distance between us and the man tailing us. But no matter what I did, he stayed close, too close. The beam of his headlights filled the car, flooding every corner with light. I could see Violet's face out of the corner of my eye, pale and stiff with fear. I kept driving, hoping the gas would hold out just a little longer. I knew it was coming before it happened. The engine coughed once, twice, and then the car began to sputter. I glanced down at the fuel gauge, a hollow pit forming in my stomach. We were out of gas. The headlights behind us burned brighter, a relentless reminder that we had run out of time. Violet gripped my arm, panic rippling through her touch. "What now?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of hopelessness. For a second, everything went still in my mind, a moment of pure blank panic. Then, out of nowhere, I remembered the cemetery just around the next corner. It wasn't a plan. It was pure instinct. "We run," I said, slamming the gear into park and yanking the keys from the ignition. Violet didn't hesitate. She threw open the door, and we bolted into the night, leaving the dead car and the roaring engine behind us. We sprinted toward the cemetery, feet pounding against the pavement, hearts racing against the sound of the car screeching to a halt behind us. When we reached the cemetery wall, I didn't think. I leaped, grabbing onto the rough stone and pulling myself up. Violet was right behind me, scrambling up the wall as if her life depended on it, which, judging by the sound of footsteps closing in, it did. We dropped onto the other side, landing hard on the cold ground. The tombstones loomed around us like silent witnesses. I could hear nothing but our gasping breaths and the pounding of my own heart. For a brief moment, I thought we were safe. Then I heard it, the sound of someone scaling the wall behind us, a soft thud as boots hit the ground on the other side. The ex-boyfriend had followed us into the cemetery. We crouched low behind the nearest tombstone, trying to control our breath. The cold stone pressed against my back as I peered out into the darkness, straining to see through the gaps between the graves. For a second, all I could hear was the pounding of blood in my ears, but then came the crunch of boots on gravel. He was moving, slow, deliberate steps, searching for us. Violet trembled beside me, her breath coming in short bursts, though she tried to stay quiet. I could feel the tension radiating off her like a pulse. Every second stretched longer, every sound seemed amplified, the scrape of his boots, the soft swish of leaves moving in the night air. We pressed deeper into the shadows, praying they would be enough. The man muttered something under his breath, angry words laced with frustration. I caught glimpses of his silhouette as he moved between the headstones, jerking his head left and right, hunting. I felt like prey, trapped in the open with nowhere to go. Moving would make too much noise, but staying still meant waiting for him to stumble upon us. And with each second that ticked by, the walls of that graveyard seemed to close in tighter. He was close, too close. His footsteps scuffed against a stone just a few feet from where we crouched. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't look our way. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move, to run, but I knew it would only draw him closer. Violet shifted beside me, just the smallest adjustment, but it was enough to send a tiny pebble rolling across the gravel. It sounded deafening in the silence. I felt her freeze, both of us locked in terror as we waited for him to react. He stopped. His shadow loomed against the headstone, and I could hear the slow, heavy breaths of someone straining to hold back rage. He muttered curses, pacing a few steps, his frustration boiling over. In the pitch black, without a flashlight, he was just as blind as we were, but his determination was relentless. He lingered, as if weighing his options, and I knew we were seconds away from being found. I tensed, ready to run if it came to that. But then, as if something broke inside him, he let out a sharp breath and stormed off, cursing under his breath. The sound of his footsteps faded as he stomped toward the wall. We stayed frozen in place, listening as he scrambled over the stone wall and landed on the other side with a soft thud. And then, silence. Even with the quiet settling back over the cemetery, we didn't move. Not at first. Fear rooted us in place, each of us too afraid that the faintest noise would bring him back. My heart was still hammering in my chest, and I knew Violet could feel the tension radiating off me. We stayed like that, waiting in the dark for what felt like hours. The cold began to creep into my bones, but I didn't care. I wasn't ready to believe it was over. Every noise made me flinch, a distant car passing, the rustle of wind through the trees. Every second I spent there, crouched among the dead, felt more surreal, as if the world beyond the cemetery had ceased to exist. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. I whispered, more to myself than to Violet, "We need to move." She nodded silently, and we crept from our hiding spot, keeping low to the ground as we made our way toward the wall. Climbing over felt like an eternity. Every scrape of my boots on the stone sent a ripple of anxiety through me, but we made it to the top without incident. Dropping back down on the other side, I held my breath once more, expecting to see him waiting, standing in the dark like a shadow that never left. But the street was empty. His car was gone. We stood there in the quiet street, both of us too shaken to say anything. The night pressed in from all sides, the empty road stretching out before us like a void. There was no sign of him, no sound of an engine or footsteps, nothing to suggest he had ever been there at all. I was running late, and every minute counted. Instead of taking the long route back to my apartment, I decided to cut through a property I'd seen from the main road. It looked abandoned, an old lot with weeds taking over every surface, a sagging fence on the verge of collapse, and windows covered with boards. I knew it was a little sketchy, but the thought of saving 10 minutes overruled any hesitation. The gate hung open slightly, its metal frame creaking as I pushed it wider. I glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out and yell at me for trespassing, but everything remained eerily quiet. As soon as I stepped through, the noise of passing cars faded, swallowed by the thick air hanging over the lot. The driveway beneath my shoes was cracked and worn, weeds sprouting through every fissure. A few rusted cars sat scattered in the yard, their bodies eaten away by time. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten, left to decay, with no one to care what happened within its boundaries. I moved quickly, sticking to the narrow path between the debris and overgrown grass. The silence pressed down on me, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes. My heart raced, not from fear, I told myself, but from the pressure of getting back on time. The air felt heavy, though, and with each step, that weight seemed to settle deeper into my chest. Halfway across the yard, I noticed something odd. A series of small dirt mounds, spaced out like someone had carefully planned where each one would go. They weren't big enough to be graves, but the arrangement felt deliberate. Each pile stood like a marker for something buried just beneath the surface. I stopped and looked around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was an old gardening project, I thought, or someone's abandoned attempt at landscaping. But the mounds didn't look old. The soil was freshly turned, still dark and loose, as if someone had been digging there recently. A chill ran through me as I stood among the mounds, wondering why anyone would bother. The place looked abandoned, so why would someone come back just to dig holes? My eyes flicked toward the house at the far end of the property. Most of the windows were sealed with warped boards, but the structure loomed over the lot, casting long shadows. I told myself to keep moving. This was just a shortcut, nothing more. Whatever those mounds were, they didn't involve me. But my legs felt heavier with each step, the unease settling in like an itch I couldn't scratch. As I made my way further through the yard, the silence became suffocating. Then, cutting through the stillness, I heard it. A low, metallic scraping sound coming from the direction of the house. I stopped dead in my tracks, every nerve in my body on edge. I scanned the windows, searching for movement. Most were boarded up tight, but on the upper floor, one window was cracked open. It swayed gently in the breeze, as if it had been left ajar for a reason. The scraping noise stopped briefly, leaving me standing in the unsettling quiet, heart pounding in my ears. Then the sound returned, sharper this time, and closer. It was as if something inside the house was dragging metal against the walls, slow and deliberate. I took an involuntary step back, my shoes crunching against the gravel. I needed to leave. That much was clear. But I knew running would only draw attention. So I forced myself to stay calm, glancing at the far end of the lot where the exit waited. If I could just make it to the gate, I'd be back on the road, out of this place. Trying not to panic, I quickened my pace, keeping my eyes fixed on the path ahead. But as I passed one of the dirt mounds, my foot sank slightly into the soil. The ground gave way beneath me, and I stumbled forward. When I looked down, I saw that the mound had collapsed, exposing the corner of something buried just beneath the surface, something wrapped in thick black plastic. The plastic glistened in the fading daylight, and I could see the edges twisted and tied off tightly, as if to keep whatever was inside sealed away. My stomach churned. I told myself it could be anything. Trash, old furniture, who knew? But the weight of what I was seeing pressed against me, and I knew better. This wasn't normal. I stared at the mound, feeling the ground shift slightly beneath my feet. The air felt colder now, as if the day had suddenly turned against me. Whatever was buried here, it wasn't something I wanted to know more about. And then I heard it. The front door of the house creaked open with an agonizing groan, shattering the fragile silence that hung over the lot. I looked up, heart hammering, and saw a figure standing in the doorway, a dark shape, motionless, watching me. I couldn't make out any details from where I stood, but the way it stood there, silent and still, made every hair on my body stand on end. I froze, my mind racing. The figure in the doorway didn't move, just stood there, watching. I squinted, hoping to make out a face, a gesture, anything to break the tension. But there was nothing. The shadow was still, blending with the darkened entrance, as if waiting for me to make the first move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I fought the urge. Running felt like the worst possible thing to do, like it would trigger something I wasn't ready to confront. Instead, I forced myself to take slow, steady steps toward the far end of the property, pretending I hadn't seen the figure. The silence pressed harder against my ears, amplifying every step I took on the uneven ground. I felt the figure's gaze follow me as I moved through the yard. I glanced toward the plastic-wrapped bundle in the dirt mound one last time, resisting the urge to look back at the house. I just needed to get to the gate. The gravel crunched louder beneath my feet as I neared the edge of the property, but I could still feel it, that figure, standing there, watching every movement I made. The gate loomed ahead, just a few more steps away, but my feet felt sluggish, as if the very ground beneath me were conspiring to hold me back. The mounds of dirt scattered throughout the yard seemed larger now, their presence more ominous. I swore I could feel the soft earth shifting beneath me, but I didn't stop to check. With every step, I expected to hear footsteps behind me. The weight of being followed, even if I couldn't hear it, grew heavier. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out everything except the urgency to get out. Finally, I reached the gate, slipping through the narrow opening without daring to look back. My hands fumbled as I pushed the gate closed behind me, the metal screeching on its rusty hinges. I hoped the sound would signal the end of whatever followed me inside that lot. I stepped onto the main road, and only then did I risk a glance back. The figure from the doorway had stepped into the yard. It stood there, framed by the dark house, still watching, still unmoving. There was no rush to follow me, no attempt to chase, just a silent presence, lingering at the edge of the yard like a warning. As soon as I turned the corner and felt the warmth of the streetlights overhead, I broke into a sprint. My legs burned as I ran, but I didn't care. I had to get as far away from that property as possible. I didn't stop until I reached the familiar streets near my building, my lungs aching and heart pounding in my chest. Even then, the fear hadn't left me. It clung to my skin like cold sweat, and every shadow felt like a threat. Inside my apartment, I locked the door, bolting it twice before collapsing onto the floor, gasping for breath. But even with the door shut and the city noise filtering in through my windows, I couldn't shake the image of that figure standing in the yard watching me leave. I tried to tell myself it was over, that I was safe, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. What was buried beneath those mounds, and who or what was standing in that doorway? The next morning, I went to the police, hoping to put the whole thing to rest. I told them about the dirt mounds, the plastic-wrapped object, and the shadowy figure in the doorway. They listened, taking notes, but their expressions remained indifferent. One officer jotted down my statement as if it were just another strange call in a city full of them. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I knew I shouldn't go back, but the questions gnawed at me, and I needed to see if anything had changed. When I arrived, the gate was shut tight. A heavy padlock clamped around the latch. A large "No Trespassing" sign had been nailed to the fence, its bold letters a silent warning to stay away. The once overgrown yard was eerily still, the dirt mounds hidden from view behind the fence. I was running out of options. Bills stacked up faster than I could count, and the looming deadlines felt like a weight I couldn't escape. The longer I searched for work, the more desperate I became. That's when I stumbled across the ad, something that shouldn't have seemed so appealing, but in my state, it felt like a lifeline. Quick gig, no experience needed, high pay, start immediately. I clicked the link, and within minutes, I was on the phone with a man named Greg. His voice was easygoing, reassuring. He asked if I was ready to work that same day. It felt strange how fast it moved, but I didn't question it. I needed the money, and it seemed simple enough. Assisting with deliveries, no heavy lifting beyond a few crates. When I met Greg at the storage facility on the edge of town, he gave off an odd vibe. Friendly, but there was something under the surface I couldn't put my finger on. He talked fast, gave little details, and dodged questions like a pro. "The job's easy," he said with a grin. "Just help me load, ride along, and unload. That's it." He warned me not to ask too many questions, but he said it with a smile, so I laughed it off. The storage facility felt eerily quiet. Long rows of metal doors, cold air that smelled of rust, and a heavy stillness. But I brushed it aside. I couldn't afford to be picky. I told myself it was just a day's work. What was the worst that could happen? The first delivery went smoothly enough. The crates were heavy but manageable, and we loaded them into the back of Greg's van without issue. As we drove to a suburban neighborhood, I tried making small talk, but Greg kept his answers short, steering the conversation away from anything personal or specific. When we reached the destination, a man stepped out of the house, nodded at Greg, and disappeared with the crates. It felt strange how little was exchanged. No paperwork, no receipt, no words. But I figured maybe this was just an off-the-books gig, maybe a little shady, but nothing to lose sleep over. By the second day, though, the cracks started to show. One of the crates was leaking, a thick, dark liquid slowly dripping from a corner, pooling on the floor of the storage unit. I nudged Greg, asking him what it was, but his expression darkened instantly. "Don't worry about it," he muttered, wiping the corner of the crate with a rag. "Just load it." Something about the way he said it made my stomach churn. But I needed the cash, so I kept my mouth shut and did what I was told. As the van rumbled through the streets that day, I couldn't shake the thought of that leaking crate and what might be inside it. By the third night, the atmosphere shifted completely. The deliveries became more erratic, each one stranger than the last. We stopped at remote locations, abandoned lots, old industrial sites, houses tucked so far out of town, it felt like we were crossing into another world. That night, Greg handed me a flashlight and told me to follow him into an old factory. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of mildew, and every sound echoed, amplifying the quiet tension between us. As I unloaded one of the crates from the cart, I noticed something that made my skin crawl: deep scratches on the inside walls of the wooden box. They weren't accidental scratches from loading equipment. These marks were deliberate, desperate, the kind of marks something would make if it wanted out. I stared at them longer than I should have, frozen in place. Greg's voice snapped me back to reality. "Hurry it up," he barked. I told myself it had to be my imagination. Maybe the crate was old, maybe the marks meant nothing. But the uneasy feeling settled deep in my gut, and I knew I wouldn't be able to ignore it for long. The next delivery took us to a house far out in the countryside, surrounded by fields and dense woods. It was the kind of place you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. We pulled up just after midnight, and the headlights illuminated the front of the house, a rundown structure with chipped paint and overgrown weeds. As I helped Greg unload the crates, my eyes were drawn to the front door. It wasn't just any door. It had multiple locks bolted onto the outside. Not just one or two, but 5 or 6, all in a neat row, glinting under the weak moonlight. They weren't meant to keep people out. They were meant to keep something inside. Greg caught me staring. "Focus," he muttered sharply, his earlier friendliness now completely gone. I tried to shake off the creeping fear, but it clung to me like a second skin. Every delivery felt heavier, not just physically but mentally. I couldn't stop thinking about the claw marks, the locks, and the crates leaking that dark liquid. None of it added up, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more it gnawed at me. I knew I should walk away, quit before I got in too deep. But Greg was watching me more closely now, and I could feel an unspoken threat hanging in the air between us. It was as if he was waiting, watching for the moment I'd falter. The next delivery was the one that finally pushed me over the edge. Greg had me meet him even later than usual, well past midnight. And this time, the destination was a crumbling old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. We parked near a side entrance. Greg handed me the keys to the van and told me to wait inside while he went in to meet someone. "Don't leave the van," he said, his voice colder than usual. "I won't be long." I sat in the driver's seat, engine off, and tried to convince myself that this was just another strange job. But something felt different, like the air itself was heavier. My hands fidgeted on the wheel as I stared into the dark, empty parking lot. Then I heard it. At first it was faint, a soft shuffling sound coming from the back of the van. I froze, straining to listen. It wasn't the kind of noise you'd expect from crates shifting in transit. It was deliberate, rhythmic. And then I heard it again, something that sounded disturbingly like a breath. My pulse skyrocketed. I turned slowly, staring at the dark outline of the crate stacked in the rear. Every instinct told me not to move, not to look. But the sound came again, clearer this time. Something alive, stirring within the confines of the cargo. I knew then that this wasn't just some off-the-books delivery service. Whatever was in those crates wasn't just stuff. It was alive. When Greg returned, I was still gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding, trying to act normal. But I couldn't hold it in anymore. As soon as he slid into the passenger seat, I blurted it out. "I'm done. I can't do this anymore." Greg turned slowly, his expression unreadable at first. But then his face changed. His friendly demeanor evaporated like smoke, replaced by something colder, harder. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment I thought he might lunge at me. "You walk away now," he said softly, dangerously, "and you better forget everything." The way he said it chilled me to my core. It wasn't a warning, it was a threat. He didn't need to say anything else. I knew if I pushed it further, things could get ugly fast. I stared at him for a second longer, weighing my options. But there really wasn't a choice. I had to get out, no matter what. I didn't wait for Greg to say anything else. The moment he turned his attention back to the warehouse, I acted. Without a second thought, I threw the van into reverse, the tires screeching against the cracked asphalt as I backed out of the lot. Greg shouted something, but I didn't stick around to hear it. I floored the accelerator, leaving the warehouse, and Greg, behind in a blur of dark streets and streetlights. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, my hands white-knuckling the wheel as I drove aimlessly through the city. I didn't stop until I was back in familiar territory, surrounded by the safety of streetlights and passing cars. Only then did I pull over, hands shaking violently as I tried to catch my breath. The job, the paycheck, it didn't matter anymore. All I wanted was to be as far away from Greg and those crates as possible. The next morning, I went to the temp agency, determined to report everything. But the woman behind the desk gave me a puzzled look when I mentioned Greg. "We don't have anyone by that name in our system," she said. I pressed her, telling her about the job, the storage facility, the van, everything. But she just shook her head. "I think you might be mistaken," she said kindly, like she thought I was confused or making it up. I tried calling Greg's number, but it had already been disconnected. I even drove back to the warehouse, hoping to find some trace of him. But the place was empty. No crates, no van, nothing. The moment I stepped off the plane, I felt a thrill I hadn't experienced in years. Months of planning and saving had led to this. A solo trip to a city halfway across the world. My bags felt light, my mind was clear, and the freedom of having no schedule stretched out before me like a blank canvas. The first few days were a blur of new experiences. I strolled through museums filled with centuries-old art, bartered at colorful markets, where unfamiliar scents wafted through the air, and lost myself wandering narrow streets with no particular destination in mind. It was exactly what I had hoped for. Days that melted into each other, filled with nothing but exploration and quiet reflection. But on the third day, everything shifted. I was sitting at a cozy cafe, sipping on a strong coffee, watching the world pass by. The charm of the city's life played out in front of me, couples chatting, locals hurrying along, and tourists like me soaking in every moment. That's when I saw him for the first time. He sat 2 tables away, a man holding a newspaper, his posture too stiff to be casual. His eyes flicked over the top of the paper now and then, scanning the space, but he never turned a page. I noticed it, but I didn't think much of it at the time. People come and go in places like this. He was just another face in the crowd, or so I thought. Later that afternoon, I visited one of the city's renowned museums, excited to lose myself among the artifacts and exhibits. The thrill of being in a foreign place still hadn't worn off. I walked through the massive halls, admiring everything from ancient statues to contemporary installations. As I left the building, ready to continue my day, a flicker of movement caught my eye. There, across the street, stood the man from the cafe. He wasn't looking at the museum or at anything in particular. His gaze drifted lazily across the crowd. But I knew he wasn't just another bystander. I could feel it in the way he stood, too still, as if he was waiting for something. I hesitated for a moment, but told myself I was being ridiculous. It's a big city. People overlap. It was just a coincidence, I reasoned. Shrugging off the unease that tugged at the edge of my thoughts, I moved on. But something lingered. Even as I walked away, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. There was a weight in the air now, a subtle pressure I couldn't shake, like the beginning of a storm. The next day I explored a different part of the city, a neighborhood known for its vibrant street art and bustling food stalls. It was a maze of colorful murals and narrow alleys, with vendors selling everything from hand-stitched bags to grilled skewers. I was determined to enjoy myself, to make the most of this trip. But then I saw him again. He stood on the other side of the street, half hidden by a row of food stalls. He wasn't pretending to read a newspaper this time. He stood still, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed directly on me. There was no mistaking it now. He was watching me. My pulse quickened, and I felt the first real twinge of fear ripple through me. I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving and not make a scene. If I acted like everything was normal, maybe he'd lose interest. Or at least, that's what I hoped. I wandered deeper into the neighborhood, weaving through the crowded streets, hoping to shake the uneasy feeling. But every time I glanced around, I half expected to see him standing there, watching. And then rounding a corner, I saw him again, closer this time, walking slowly in my direction. By now I was sure of it. This man was following me, and it wasn't some harmless coincidence. The realization hit me with a cold, creeping dread, and I knew I had to act. I needed a plan, and fast. I spotted a small bookstore tucked between two buildings and ducked inside, hoping it would give me a moment to think. The air inside was musty, and the shelves were packed with books that seemed untouched for years. I pretended to browse, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window. There he was, standing just outside, hands still in his pockets, as if waiting for me to come out. He didn't pace or fidget. He simply stood there, a statue in the flow of the city, unmoving while the world moved around him. My mind raced. I couldn't confront him, not in a place where I didn't speak the language, far from anyone I could turn to for help. I couldn't just stand there forever either. So I stayed as long as I could, hoping he'd get bored and leave. But he didn't. He waited, and I could feel the minutes dragging by, thick with tension. Finally, I decided to make my move. I slipped out of the bookstore and headed in the opposite direction, walking quickly but trying not to draw attention to myself. My heart pounded in my chest as I wove through the crowded streets, forcing myself to stay calm, not to look back too often. I thought I'd lost him until I caught a glimpse of his reflection in a store window. He was still there, moving faster now, as if he knew I was trying to get away. The streets around me blurred as I pushed forward, moving faster now, threading through clusters of pedestrians. My heart pounded harder with each step, every instinct screaming that I needed to escape. I threw a quick glance over my shoulder. He was still there, walking with purpose, closing the distance between us with every second. I turned down a narrow alleyway, hoping to lose him in the maze of streets, but the fear gnawed at me, relentless and unforgiving. The alley felt too quiet, the sound of my footsteps bouncing off the stone walls like an alarm I couldn't silence. I could feel him closing in, like a shadow stretching longer in the fading light. As I emerged from the alley, a stroke of luck appeared. A busy metro station just ahead. The crowd outside moved like a river, a perfect opportunity to disappear. Without looking back, I plunged into the throng of commuters, letting the current of bodies carry me toward the ticket booths. My hands shook as I fumbled with the machine, shoving coins into the slot. Every second felt like an eternity, the thought of him closing in suffocating me. Finally, the ticket spat out, and I forced my way through the turnstile. I ran down the steps toward the platform, my breath jagged and uneven. The train arrived with a low screech, doors sliding open to reveal the crowded car. I pushed my way inside, not even caring where it was headed, only that it was taking me far from where I'd just been. I squeezed into a corner, using the bodies around me as a shield, hoping to disappear into the crowd. As the train lurched forward, I scanned the platform through the windows, my heart hammering in my chest. I expected to see him standing there, searching for me among the faces. But as the station blurred into darkness, there was no sign of him. For the first time in what felt like hours, I exhaled, my body slumping against the cool metal of the train's walls. The sound of the train clattering along the tracks was the sweetest noise I'd ever heard, a sign that I was finally out of his reach. When I returned to my hotel room that night, I locked the door behind me with shaking hands. I threw the bolt, slid the chain across, and checked the handle twice, then 3 times, before I allowed myself to take a step back. But even behind that locked door, the fear followed me, curling in the corners of the room like smoke. I tried to distract myself, to pretend everything was fine. But every sound in the hallway outside made my heart leap. A passing conversation, the distant ding of the elevator, even the muted hum of the city beyond the window felt ominous. Every noise became a potential threat, every passing shadow a reminder that he could still be out there, waiting. The rest of my trip was spent inside that room. I didn't dare leave again, not for food, not for air, nothing. I sat on the bed with the curtains drawn, the television flickering without sound, trying to convince myself that I was safe. But the silence only gave space for the fear to grow, filling every empty moment with the thought of what might have happened if I hadn't made it to the train in time. The day I left the city, I felt an overwhelming urge to look over my shoulder. The airport was bustling with people, yet every passing face made me uneasy. I kept expecting to see him there, lurking in the crowd, waiting for me to lower my guard. But he never appeared. The flight home was long and restless. I kept my eyes on the other passengers, watching for any sign of familiarity, even though I knew it was impossible. He was part of the city, part of that trip, a shadow I'd left behind. But the fear didn't stay there. The day started off perfect, bright sunlight cutting through crisp morning air as we gathered at the trailhead. There were 8 of us, all excited to spend the day hiking through the forest and reaching the scenic overlook that marked the end of the trail. We'd been talking about this hike for weeks, and the energy was high. Laughs echoed through the parking lot as we pulled on our backpacks, laced our boots, and took the first steps onto the well-marked trail. The forest was alive with sounds, birds chirping high above, the soft rustling of leaves under our feet, and the occasional distant chatter of other hikers. I fell into step with the group, feeling at ease among familiar friends. The trail wound lazily through the forest, sunlight filtering through the thick canopy, painting the path with patches of golden light. We took our time, stopping often to snap photos and joke about how we were practically wilderness experts. There was no sense of urgency, just friends enjoying a rare day outside, away from work, deadlines, and routines. Each bend in the trail brought a new scene to admire, a trickling creek, moss-covered rocks, towering pines that seemed to touch the sky. The distance between us ebbed and flowed naturally. Some sped ahead, eager to reach the overlook, while others lingered behind, distracted by interesting plants or photo opportunities. There was no concern, no need to stay huddled together. It was a popular trail, after all, no way to get lost. The path narrowed as the trail twisted deeper into the forest, forcing us to move single file. Conversation grew quieter, replaced by the rhythmic sound of boots crunching against dirt and leaves. I kept pace easily until I felt the knot in my left boot loosen, a nuisance I knew I'd regret if I didn't fix it. I dropped to one knee, pulling the laces tight and knotting them securely. The group was still moving ahead, but I wasn't worried. People always stopped to wait when someone fell behind, right? I took a glance up the trail, expecting to see at least one of them slowing down or glancing back. But all I saw was the empty path stretching forward, swallowed by the dense forest. I stood and dusted off my hands, telling myself it was nothing. They couldn't be far ahead. It wasn't the first time someone had drifted behind during a group hike. All it would take was a few quick steps, and I'd be back in the fold, sharing in their conversations. I started walking again, picking up my pace slightly. The forest, which had felt so welcoming earlier, now seemed thicker, the trees closing in from all sides. Still, I told myself it was fine, nothing unusual. They'd be waiting around the next corner. But as I rounded bend after bend, there was no one. The laughter and chatter that had filled the morning air were gone, replaced only by the sound of my own steps. I stopped for a moment, listening. Nothing, just the forest. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and the trail kept winding in confusing directions. I started to wonder how far ahead they could really be, if they were just beyond the next curve, or if somehow the group had gotten much further than I thought. My heartbeat quickened. I didn't remember the trail being this long or the forest this quiet. Every few steps I'd glance behind me, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. It was as if the entire group had vanished without a trace. My gut tightened as I tried to recall how many turns we'd made, whether we had followed a split I hadn't noticed. I called out their names, one after another, my voice cracking through the stillness. The forest swallowed every sound. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my thumb fumbling over the lock screen. No service, just the red sliver of battery left, mocking me. I knew the trail wasn't dangerous, but the way it twisted ahead, unfamiliar and silent, began to mess with my head. I felt as if I had walked too far. Was I still on the right trail? I couldn't remember. The day was slipping away, the sun's golden rays dimming as the shadows of the forest stretched longer. I tried to keep moving, each step more uncertain than the last. The first sharp sting of fear hit me when the sun dipped lower, casting a cold blue light across the forest floor. I realized I had no idea how long I'd been walking alone. Panic started to scratch at the back of my mind as I tried to reason through what might have happened. Had they assumed I was ahead of them somehow? Or had they taken a turn I missed? I picked up my pace, feet stumbling over roots and rocks as the weight of being alone in the forest started pressing on me. There was no sound, but the crunch of leaves underfoot, no movement, but the shifting shadows between the trees. I called out again, louder this time, but my voice felt distant, as if the forest absorbed it before it could travel far. My phone buzzed weakly in my hand, a reminder of its dying battery, but it didn't matter. There was no signal here. I stood still, turning in slow circles, trying to remember which way I had come. Every direction looked the same, just endless rows of dark trees stretching into the distance. Then, through the dimming light, I saw it, a familiar object half hidden beneath a pile of leaves. One of our backpacks, the bright fabric peeking out from the undergrowth. My heart sank as I knelt beside it. The zippers were open, the contents scattered as if someone had rifled through it in a hurry. I grabbed the bag, turning it over in my hands, but it was empty, just a shell, discarded and useless. I called out again, desperation thick in my throat, but there was no response. Only the wind brushing through the treetops above. That was the moment it hit me. I couldn't stay. I had no idea where the group was or what had happened to them, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to get out of the forest. Whatever had taken them, if anything had, wasn't something I wanted to encounter. I didn't waste time wondering how the backpack got there, whether someone had left it behind, dropped it, or if something worse had happened. All I knew was that it shouldn't be there, empty and discarded. The sight of it sent a chill through me, a warning that I couldn't afford to ignore. I stood up, heart racing, and forced my legs to keep moving. I tried to convince myself that the group might be further along the trail, that maybe someone had dropped the backpack accidentally and kept going. But deep down, I knew something was off. My hands were shaking as I gripped the straps of my own pack tighter, fighting the rising urge to run. The trail twisted endlessly, every turn looking identical to the last. I tried to retrace my steps mentally, but everything blurred together. Trees, dirt, roots, shadows. My surroundings felt hostile now, as if the forest had shifted into something unfamiliar. The cold air pressed against me, slipping through my jacket, making it hard to think clearly. The shadows grew darker, and the trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches interlocking high above to block out what little sunlight remained. I told myself to keep moving, to focus on finding the trailhead. But every step felt heavier, as if I were dragging something invisible along with me. My walk turned into a jog, then a full sprint as fear took over. I didn't know if it was rational, whether I was running from something real or just the possibility of being lost forever. But I couldn't stop myself. The faster I ran, the more the forest seemed to close in, the path narrowing, branches clawing at my arms and legs. I stumbled several times, my boots catching on roots and loose stones, but I forced myself up each time. I kept running, lungs burning, legs aching, desperate to put as much distance as I could between myself and that empty backpack. The trail didn't make sense anymore, twisting and turning in ways I couldn't predict, with forks that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I chose paths at random, following what looked like the most well-trodden route, praying it would lead me out of the forest. The silence around me was unbearable. I wanted to hear something, anything, to prove I wasn't completely alone. But the forest offered no comfort. Just the crunch of my boots and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees as if mocking my desperation. I ran until my body couldn't take it anymore. My legs trembled with exhaustion, and my breath came in ragged gasps. Just when I thought I'd have to stop, I saw it, a faint sliver of light cutting through the tangled branches above. Sunlight. It was faint, but it was enough. I clung to that glimmer of hope like a lifeline, forcing myself to move toward it. Each step was agony, my muscles screaming in protest, but I pushed through the pain. I wasn't going to let this forest keep me. The trees began to thin, and the light grew brighter. My heart pounded harder, fueled by the thought of escape. I stumbled through the last stretch of forest, branches scraping at my skin, until I finally broke free of the trees and into open air. The trailhead parking lot spread out before me, bathed in the late afternoon sun. For a moment I just stood there, panting, blinking against the sudden brightness. It felt unreal, as if I had crossed from one world into another. Then I saw them, my friends, standing by the cars, chatting casually as if nothing had happened. One of them looked up, spotted me, and gave a friendly wave. "There you are! We thought you went ahead," he called out, his voice light and unconcerned. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, and my heart was still racing from the run. I stared at them, waiting for someone to acknowledge what had happened. But there was nothing. It was supposed to be simple, just a quick drive back home after a weekend with friends. I'd made the trip so many times that I could probably do it with my eyes closed. The drive was familiar, the kind where you slip into autopilot, not needing to think about turns or directions. I liked it that way. There was something comforting about driving on the same roads I'd always known, watching the same landmarks flash by like old friends. It was late afternoon when I hit the highway. The weather was clear, the road smooth beneath the tires. I glanced at the GPS out of habit, but there was nothing unusual. A couple of hours to home, just highway driving and a few rural roads before the familiar streets of my neighborhood. I let the music play softly in the background, my mind drifting between the weekend's memories and the thought of my own bed waiting for me at the end of the trip. But about halfway through, I saw it, a bright orange detour sign standing at the side of the road. I didn't remember it being there before. It pointed down a side road I'd never taken, with bold letters announcing that the highway ahead was closed for roadwork. At first I hesitated. I could have kept going, risked it, and hoped the closure wasn't serious. But I was tired, and the last thing I wanted was to be stuck in a construction zone. So I followed the detour without thinking twice, trusting it would guide me back to the highway soon enough. It was just a small detour. How bad could it be? The detour road started off normal enough, a narrow two-lane stretch cutting through a dense patch of forest. The trees on either side leaned close, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. At first, it was peaceful in a way. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled light onto the cracked asphalt. It was quiet, too quiet. After a few minutes, I noticed something odd. There were no other cars. I thought I'd see at least one or two vehicles taking the same detour, but the road was completely empty, just me and the trees. There were no houses either, no signs of life beyond the thick forest pressing in on both sides. As I drove deeper into the woods, the road began to change. The pavement grew rough, riddled with cracks and potholes, as if it hadn't been maintained in years. My tires thudded over the uneven surface, forcing me to slow down. I glanced at the GPS, hoping for some reassurance, but the screen showed nothing, just a gray void where the road should have been. A knot of unease tightened in my chest. I told myself it was just an old road, one that didn't make it onto the GPS map. It happened sometimes, especially in rural areas, but something about it didn't feel right. The longer I drove, the more isolated I felt, as if the road was pulling me away from the world I knew, and into a place where I didn't belong. I was trying to push the unease out of my mind when I saw it. A car sitting on the shoulder just ahead. It was tilted slightly, as if one of its tires had gone flat, and the headlights were still on, flickering weakly in the afternoon light. I slowed down as I approached, peering through the windshield to see if anyone was inside. But the driver's seat was empty. The door on that side hung open, swaying slightly in the breeze. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. There was no sign of the driver, no movement at all. It looked like the car had been abandoned in a hurry. But why would someone leave it like that? And why were the headlights still on if the car had been left for a long time? For a moment, I thought about stopping. Maybe someone needed help. But something deep inside me told me to keep driving. I couldn't explain it, but the thought of getting out of the car filled me with dread. I pressed down on the accelerator, my heart pounding a little faster as I left the abandoned car behind. I tried to shake off the unsettling encounter with the abandoned car, telling myself it wasn't that strange. People's cars break down all the time, right? Maybe the driver had gone to get help and just hadn't come back yet. But as I continued down the road, that uneasy feeling only grew stronger. A few minutes later, I came across another car, this one farther off the road, with its hood popped open. Leaves and dirt covered the windshield, and the tires were half buried in mud, as if it had been sitting there for weeks. I slowed down again, staring at the car, my mind racing with questions. This one looked like it had been here for a while, but how could that be? If this was a detour for road work, how had these cars ended up abandoned along the way? I glanced in the rearview mirror, thinking about turning around and finding another route, but the narrow road and thick trees made it impossible to turn back. There was no room to maneuver, no side roads to take. I had no choice but to keep going forward, deeper into the woods. That's when I realized something else. There were no signs, no mile markers, no detour notices, no indicators of where this road would lead. It was as if the road existed outside of any map or route, a forgotten path winding through the forest with no destination in sight. The knot in my stomach tightened, and I gripped the steering wheel a little harder, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. I told myself that the road would reconnect with the highway soon. It had to. But as I drove on, the trees seemed to close in even tighter, the road narrowing until it felt like I was the only person left in the world, driving toward a place I didn't want to reach. The road wound deeper into the forest, and the longer I drove, the more it felt like the trees were closing in. I pressed forward, gripping the wheel tightly, praying that the road would lead me back to the highway soon. Then I saw him. Up ahead, standing right in the middle of the road, was a man. I slowed the car, squinting to make out his shape through the windshield. He wasn't moving, just standing there, still as a statue. As I got closer, details began to emerge. His clothes were torn, hanging off him in strips, and his skin was streaked with mud. He looked as if he had crawled out of the earth. There was no sign of fear or confusion on his face. He didn't wave or move, just stood there, staring at me with hollow eyes. My pulse pounded in my ears as my car crawled forward, inching closer. He didn't react, didn't blink. He just watched, like he was waiting for something. Every instinct screamed at me not to stop. I veered the car to the left, my tires skimming the edge of the narrow road as I swerved around him. For a moment, I locked eyes with him through the side window. His face was blank, but it left me with the unmistakable impression that I wasn't supposed to be here. I pressed the gas pedal, heart hammering, and the man vanished into the rearview mirror. Even as I sped away, his expression stayed with me. Those empty, waiting eyes burned into my memory. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road twisted and narrowed even more, forcing me to slow down despite the fear urging me to race forward. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man running after me. But he was gone. Only the endless line of trees stretched behind me. My heart was pounding, and every muscle in my body felt tense, as if the forest itself was closing in, trying to swallow me whole. I tried to focus on the road ahead, hoping for some sign of escape, but the trees blurred past in a dizzying rush. Then, just as panic started to claw at me, I saw it, the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. Relief washed over me like a wave. I pressed the gas pedal harder, the cracked pavement smoothing out beneath the tires as the road opened up into something familiar again. Within seconds, I was back on the highway, the lights from passing cars flickering through the night. My hands shook as I adjusted my grip on the wheel, still trying to comprehend what I had just driven through. I glanced one last time in the rearview mirror, but the road was gone. There was nothing behind me but a wall of dense trees, as if the detour had never existed. I stayed on the highway, forcing myself not to look back again. The hum of traffic and the glow of streetlights felt surreal after the eerie stillness of the forest road. I tried to tell myself that I was imagining things, that the detour was just a fluke, a strange stretch of forgotten road. But my mind kept drifting back to the abandoned cars, and the man. Especially the man. His expressionless stare haunted me, replaying over and over in my mind. What had he been doing out there? Why was the road not marked on my GPS? I thought about pulling over to gather my thoughts, but the idea of stopping anywhere in the dark made my skin crawl. I just wanted to get home, lock my doors, and try to forget the whole thing. When I finally reached home, the weight of the journey hit me all at once. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of everything. It didn't feel real, like it had been some strange dream that I'd only just woken from. Curiosity gnawed at me. I opened my laptop, searching for any mention of the detour or the stretch of forest I'd driven through. But there was nothing. No sign of road closures, no reports of construction, and no record of the road existing at all. It was as if I had driven through a place that didn't belong on any map. The questions piled up, but there were no answers. Who had abandoned those cars? Why was that man standing in the middle of the road? And how had the road vanished behind me, leaving only trees in its place?